Formula 1 is back. The cars are back on track and the first race of the 2023 season is only a few days away. But based on testing, we can begin to read into which teams have got it right and which teams have a lot of work to do. Overall, the pre-season testing in Bahrain was quite interesting. You had one clear favourite, one underdog team and many other developments taking place across all the teams. Now for this year, testing was only 3 days long when previously it was 6 days. This meant the teams had dramatically less time to test out their cars and fix any unforeseen issues ahead of the start of a new season. And well, it seems like the teams did struggle with the reduced time, not quite being able to prepare themselves as they would have liked. Now obviously this makes the teams' lives much harder, but makes it all more interesting for the fans. But even though it was only 3 days, we have a lot to dive into and talk about ahead of the new season. Now before I get into it, just remember that this is only testing, and so it's hard to truly know how the teams stand. For starters, the teams run different fuel loads which can affect the overall performance and the pace of the cars, and in many cases they won't be pushing to the limits. However, we can get a good idea of who is doing well and who isn't based on the amount of laps completed, level of tyre degradation, reliability, and of course lap times. So let's kick off with how the season ended with Red Bull. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Red Bull dominated testing. They began 2023 exactly as they finished in 2022 by clearly being the front-running team. Throughout the 3 days, they set the benchmark for both short-run pace, so quick qualifying times, and long-run pace, which is basically a representation of the race pace. Sergio Perez set the quickest time of the entire test with a 1 minute 30.3 on the final day of testing on the C4 tyre, beating Lewis Hamilton on the apparently quicker C5 tyre. They also racked up a good amount of laps and didn't experience any issues at all to do with the car in terms of reliability or balance. All in all, it was incredibly smooth sailing for Red Bull, and the reason for this was how they evolved the car over the winter. They basically improved every aspect of the car, which meant when they came to testing, it didn't take them too long to get settled and find the optimal balance and characteristics of the car. This meant they could use majority of the time testing to refine the setup of their car, which is something all other teams didn't have the luxury of doing. A main area, however, where Red Bull have made great improvements is in the weight of the car. Max Verstappen labelled last year's car as massively overweight, but it seems this year's car is much lighter. And that's not just through scratching paint off. Overall, based on the width of Verstappen's smile on his face, it's safe to say they are the favourites heading into the first race. So now on to second place from 2022, Scuderia Ferrari, and they find themselves in a very similar position to where they were last year. It was a very quiet and confident test for them in total, and they've said themselves they feel it's been a pretty good test. They showed promising short run pace similar to last year as they were the team that took the most pole positions, but it was the long run pace that was a bit less impressive, clearly behind Red Bull and possibly even level with Aston Martin. But Ferrari do feel it was a productive test with a lot of running and experimenting with very little unreliability issues, and so they have every right to feel confident. It does seem they have improved their straight line speed, which was desperately needed after last year, frequently watching the Red Bull push away on the straights. But that does mean they've lost out in the corners, so they definitely have more work to do in terms of finding that ideal trade-off between straight line speed and cornering speed. Also, trackside they looked pretty good with good stability and turn-in, but that Red Bull simply looked much more hooked up. Overall, I think Ferrari can be quite happy with no major issues and a good, solid, positive test hitting all the markers they wanted to. And I do have a feeling they've got something up their sleeve ahead of this weekend. And now on to Mercedes, who I would say was the most anticipated team of testing, having had their awful season last year, really looking to right their wrongs. But much like Ferrari and Red Bull, they find themselves in a very similar situation to last year. They got off the blocks pretty well on the first day with no major problems and most importantly, no porpoising, which was the root of basically all their problems last year. But heading into day 2, things really fell apart. Lewis Hamilton complained mainly of balance limitations with the car, which has followed on from last year, which has really shocked everyone given that they aren't suffering from porpoising anymore. And then, to add to their problems, Russell broke down in the afternoon with a hydraulic issue, which is certainly something we aren't used to seeing from Mercedes. However, come the final day of testing, they partly managed to get on top of these balance issues, but despite this, their pace was simply not good enough. Both short and long run pace was far off Red Bull and lacking against Ferrari and even Aston Martin on race pace. Now Mercedes have said they are planning to make changes early in the season mainly to their side pod, Whether that means evolving their unique no sidepod design or adopting a Red Bull and Ferrari style design, we don't quite know yet. However, they will be bringing a new rear wing to the first race, but this is mainly to improve their top speed, so it won't assist much in their balance issues. But overall, the headline is Mercedes have a lot of work to do if they want to catch up to Red Bull and Ferrari. However, while Mercedes needs to focus on closing that gap to the top two, they also have an unfamiliar problem in Aston Martin. These guys lit up the headlines throughout testing and is seriously looking like a possible giant killer at the start of the season. They didn't get off to the greatest of starts, with Felipe Drugovich breaking down only 10 minutes into the first day, but from that point on, they looked very good. Alonso set the second quickest time of day one, and while many believed it was mainly a glory run and not representative of true pace, Aston Martin went on to prove everyone wrong. The final race runs on day 3 by Alonso were outstanding, with his tyre degradation on the same level to that of Ferrari and much better than Mercedes. I feel the best measure for Aston Martin is how Alonso is carrying himself. He's usually visibly agitated when his car isn't doing what he wants, but throughout testing he's looked confident and quite smug. And let's not forget, Red Bull CTO Adrian Newey said even before testing that Aston Martin are a team to look out for. They are so competitive that there is a serious argument to put them ahead of Mercedes at the moment. So while Aston Martin are poised to be a giant killer, McLaren are poised to drop quite a few places in the standings after a dismal testing. They already knew before testing that they are in for a tough time, mainly because they failed to hit their car development goals for the new season. And so they endured a very difficult and underperforming testing, and much like Mercedes, will be banking on new developments early in the season to regain some competitiveness. The mood of the team is not good, and I would not be surprised to see them behind the midfield fight of Alfa Romeo, Haas and Alpine come lights out in Bahrain. So those are the headlines from the 2023 Formula 1 pre-season testing, and you've got to say it's looking very interesting with various new storylines. But generally it does seem like a bit of a continuation of last season, with Red Bull dominating out front, Ferrari pushing to close the gap into second, and Mercedes stumbling and struggling to deliver a competitive car. However, this time it seems Mercedes will need to also worry about teams behind, most notably Aston Martin. Now, I do feel Aston Martin will drop off as the season progresses and as Mercedes improves, but to what extent, I'm really not quite sure.